Welcome to Echoes of Ihsan, the podcast where we take these deep dives into Islamic texts.
Mm-hmm.
And today we're going to be looking at, it's called Muwatta Imam Malik,
Okay.
Books 27,
All right.
a Fara'id. And this is basically a compilation of Islamic legal rulings
Legal rulings. Okay.
from the 8th century.
Wow.
So it's pretty old.
Yeah.
And it gives us this fascinating look, not just into the, legal history, but also the social structures of the time,
I see.
family dynamics, all that good stuff.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
It's going to be really interesting.
And these laws, they're rooted in the Quran, obviously, but they also reflect the social and economic realities of 8th century Arabia.
Oh, for sure.
So it's kind of like a blend, you have divine decree and practical considerations.
I see.
That's what makes it so interesting to unpack.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Okay, so I guess maybe the best place to start is with this concept of fixed shares.
Okay.
That seems to be the backbone of this whole inheritance system.
Absolutely. Fixed shares, they're known as Fara'id in Arabic.
Okay.
And those are basically specific proportions of inheritance that are allocated to certain heirs, as ordained by the Quran.
Yeah.
So it's not just a free-for-all. You can't just split things up however you want.
Right, right.
There's a divine order to it.
Yeah, and I mean, the Quran itself is very clear about this. In Surah 4, verse 10, it says that the male heir receives double the share of the female heir.
Right.
And I know this is something that even today, there's a lot of debate around it.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious to hear your take on that.
Well, it's definitely a complex issue.
Yeah.
And I think to really understand it, we need to kind of shed our 21st century lens and step back into the 8th century.
Okay.
So men back then were typically the main breadwinners.
Okay.
Responsible for providing for their wives, children, often even extended family. Women, on the other hand, they usually inherited property that remained within their own lineage. So it wasn't necessarily about inherent inequality.
Gotcha.
But rather it reflected the different roles and responsibilities that they had within that society.
Okay. Okay. So context is key here.
Yes.
We can't just impose our modern values on a system from a completely different time.
Exactly. And even within Islamic scholarship, there are a lot of different interpretations about these principles.
Okay.
Some scholars emphasize the economic factors. Others focus more on the spiritual dimensions of inheritance.
Okay.
So it's not a monolithic system.
It's kind of like peeling back these layers of history.
Yes.
Trying to understand not just the laws themselves, but the whole world that they existed in.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I think that world really comes alive when we start to look at specific examples.
Okay.
So why don't we kind of dive into how inheritance was divided among various family members?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
I guess we can start with the most obvious one, children and grandchildren.
Okay.
I mean, they're the direct descendants, right?
Yes, and there's a principle called representation that comes into play here.
Okay.
It's kind of like ensuring that the lineage gets its due, even across generations.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say a son dies before his father.
Okay.
His sons, the grandsons of the deceased, they would inherit in his place.
I see.
It keeps that branch of the family tree connected to the inheritance. They're stepping into their father's shoes, so to speak.
So even if someone isn't alive, their lineage can still have a claim on the inheritance.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, what about spouses?
Okay.
Their shares seem to differ depending on whether it's the husband or the wife inheriting.
That's right. If there are no children, a husband inherits half of his wife's estate.
Okay.
But if they had children together, his share goes down to a quarter. A wife, on the other hand, she inherits a quarter of her husband's estate if there are no children.
Okay.
And an eighth if there are children.
Okay.
Again, this might reflect those societal norms that we talked about.
Yeah.
Where men often manage the family's financial affairs.
So it's like the system is taking existing family obligations into account.
Yes.
Like a husband, as traditionally the primary provider, might have more financial responsibilities even after his wife's passing.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
And we see this in other cases too. For example, a mother's inheritance depends on whether the deceased had siblings or not.
Okay.
If there are no siblings, she gets a third.
Okay.
But with siblings, her share drops to a sixth.
I see.
So it's all about this kind of delicate balancing of claims of different family members.
Right, because the siblings would then have a claim too.
Yes.
Based on their blood ties.
Exactly.
It's like this delicate web of relationships and responsibilities, all woven together by these inheritance laws.
Yes, a delicate web indeed. And sometimes those webs get quite intricate.
Okay.
For example, what happens when you've got full siblings, paternal half-siblings, and maternal half-siblings?
Oh, wow.
All in the mix.
Yeah.
That's where you really see the emphasis on agnatic lineage.
Okay.
So that is the father's side.
Okay.
Full siblings get priority over half-siblings, and then paternal half-siblings over maternal half-siblings.
So basically, like, the closer the blood tie on the dad's side, the stronger the claim.
Yes.
Seems pretty clear.
It goes even further.
Okay.
The Muwatta Imam Malik actually tells us that a paternal grandfather has a stronger claim than even half-siblings on the mother's side.
Wait, really?
Yes.
I mean, wouldn't a half-sibling be considered closer?
Yeah.
Like, relationally speaking?
It might seem counterintuitive to us,
Eh.
but again, there's a logic to it.
Okay.
Remember that emphasis on the paternal line.
Yeah.
The grandfather, as a direct male ancestor, he represents kind of like the heart of that lineage.
I see.
He even inherits in situations where the half-siblings by the mother wouldn't.
Okay.
For example, if the deceased has children.
Right.
So he holds a very pivotal position within the system.
It's like he's this guardian of the family line. It's
Yeah.
like ensuring its continuation across generations.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see how these laws were more than just like rules.
Right.
They were really shaping social structures.
That's a great way to put it. They weren't just about dividing possessions.
Yeah.
They were about preserving these familial bonds and making sure those lineages continued.
Okay, so we've covered children, grandchildren, spouses, parents, siblings, even grandparents. It's quite a detailed system.
It is.
What happens, though, if someone dies without any of these direct heirs?
Okay.
Does the inheritance just, like, disappear?
No, not at all.
Great.
The Quran actually addresses this very specifically. Okay. It outlines two types of heirless individuals.
Two types.
Yes.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. What are those two types?
So the first type is someone who dies without any direct descendants.
Okay.
Meaning no children or grandchildren.
Okay.
And also no parents.
Gotcha.
In this case, their siblings become the primary heirs. And even maternal half-siblings get a share, even if there are full siblings in the picture.
Interesting. So even in the absence of parents, that maternal connection still holds some weight.
It does.
Okay. What about the second type?
The second type is someone who dies without parents or children, but they do have siblings on their father's side.
Sure.
In this case, the paternal grandfather steps in to inherit
Oh, okay.
alongside those siblings.
Oh, so again, we see that central role of the paternal grandfather.
Yes.
It's almost like he's this fallback option, ensuring that the inheritance stays within, like, the core lineage whenever possible.
Precisely. He becomes that anchor
Yeah.
that ensures that the family line continues, even when there are no direct descendants.
You know, it's fascinating how these laws, while complex, are really creating this intricate web
Yes.
of relationships and responsibilities within a family. It's like each individual's place in that web
Yes.
is mapped out through their connection to the deceased.
That's a good way to look at it.
It's really a testament to the depth of thought that went into developing this system.
Absolutely. And it speaks to those values that were central to this society.
Yeah.
Family, lineage, responsibility, and just this deep sense of order and justice.
Now, I noticed in the Muwatta Imam Malik that there's also a list of relatives who specifically do not inherit.
Right.
For example, paternal aunts, maternal uncles are excluded. Why would that be?
That's a great observation. And again, remember that emphasis on the paternal line that we've been talking about. Well, this exclusion reinforces that.
Okay.
The inheritance flow is primarily through the father's side,
Okay.
with some exceptions, of course, like the mother and the maternal grandmother.
Gotcha.
But those on the mother's side, like maternal uncles, they generally aren't included unless they're specifically mentioned in the Quran.
So even though they are blood relatives, their connection isn't strong enough to warrant a share of the inheritance.
Right.
I wonder how this impacted family dynamics back then. Did these exclusions create, like, tension
Right.
or conflicts?
It's certainly something to think about. Like, how did individuals navigate these complex rules?
Yeah.
What kind of discussions or disagreements might have arisen?
Right.
You know, it's fascinating to imagine those personal stories
Yeah.
that were playing out within this legal framework.
Right, because ultimately these laws were shaping people's lives.
Yes.
Impacting their relationships, their finances, their futures.
Exactly.
It wasn't just a theoretical system.
Right.
It was a living reality.
And it raises a lot of questions for us today.
Yeah.
You know, about how inheritance systems, both past and present, really really shape the way that families interact and function within a society.
For sure.
What values do they reflect? What priorities do they uphold?
Yeah.
It's a topic that's definitely worth exploring further.
Absolutely. Now, I'm curious about how Islamic law dealt with inheritance when religious differences were involved.
Yeah.
Could a Muslim, for instance, inherit from a non-Muslim?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it really brings us to this intersection of religious affiliation and legal rights in early Islamic society.
Okay.
The Muwatta Imam Malik is very clear on this point.
Okay.
A Muslim cannot inherit from a non-Muslim.
Okay.
And there's that famous example of Ali ibn Abi Talib,
Right.
the Prophet Muhammad's cousin
Yeah.
and son-in-law,
Mm-hmm.
not inheriting from his own father, Abu Talib.
Right, because Abu Talib, while he was a protector of the Prophet, he never actually embraced Islam.
He did not.
And so, despite their close relationship, Ali couldn't inherit from him.
Exactly.
So religious affiliation was like a really crucial factor in determining inheritance rights.
Yes.
Okay, so the line was pretty clearly drawn there.
Yes.
But were there ever any exceptions to this rule?
Well, there were some nuances.
Okay.
For example, the concept of wala,
Okay.
which involved these ties of mutual obligation and support,
Mm-hmm.
often between a freed slave and their former master.
Okay.
That could sometimes create inheritance rights between Muslims and non-Muslims.
Oh, interesting.
It's almost like a social safety net woven into the system.
So even within a system that really prioritizes religious affiliation, there were these complexities
Yes.
and exceptions.
It wasn't always black and white.
Yeah.
Legal systems rarely are.
Right.
They evolve and they adapt
Mhm.
to really address the intricacies of human life.
Speaking of intricacies, I'm curious how Islamic law dealt with situations where there was uncertainty,
Okay.
especially regarding like the order of death.
Right.
What if two people, say a husband and wife, died in a battle or a natural disaster,
Yeah.
and it wasn't clear who died first?
That's a very insightful question.
Yeah.
And it highlights a really fundamental principle of Islamic law,
Okay.
the prioritization of certainty.
Okay.
In cases of doubt, inheritance is not distributed. It's about avoiding decisions that are based on speculation or conjecture.
So if it's unclear who died first, neither of them inherits from the other.
Exactly. The inheritance would go to their respective remaining heirs.
I see.
It's all about ensuring fairness
Yeah.
and preventing these potential disputes
Yeah.
that might arise from unclear information.
Right. You don't want to create more chaos and conflict in an already tragic situation.
Right.
Yeah.
And this principle of prioritizing certainty applies to other scenarios as well.
Okay.
For instance, if there's doubt about the legitimacy of a child,
Okay.
that child wouldn't be entitled to inherit until their lineage is clearly established.
Oh, wow.
It's about making sure the right people are receiving the inheritance.
It's almost like a very scientific approach to law.
Yes.
Like you need evidence.
You need proof.
We need proof before you can reach a conclusion.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
It really underscores the importance of rigor and objectivity
Yeah.
in these legal matters.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive already.
Yes.
I'm really starting to appreciate the complexity and nuance of Islamic inheritance law.
Me too. It's so much more than just a set of rules.
Yeah.
It's a reflection of a society's values. It's understanding of family. It's mechanisms for maintaining order and justice.
It's a window into the very fabric of a civilization.
Beautifully put.
Yeah.
And it's a window that offers so many valuable insights, even centuries later.
Yeah.
It encourages us to think critically about our own legal systems, our own values, and how they shape the world that we live in today.
That's so true.
Yeah.
It's not just about the past.
Right.
It's about understanding how those past principles continue to resonate
Yes.
in the present, shaping societies,
Right.
families across the globe.
Absolutely. And understanding these historical roots,
Yeah.
I think it gives us a much deeper appreciation for the diversity and complexity of legal systems around the world.
Now, before we move on, there's one aspect of Islamic inheritance law that really stood out to me.
Okay.
That emphasis on knowledge and certainty.
Yes.
It seems like there was a real aversion
Yeah.
to making decisions based on like guesswork
Right.
or speculation.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Like, how does that play out
Yeah, absolutely.
in this system?
Yeah. It's You've hit on like a key element of Islamic jurisprudence.
Yeah.
The concept of ilm, meaning knowledge, is absolutely paramount. Judges and legal scholars back then, they were expected to have this really deep understanding of the Quran, the Sunnah, the Prophet's traditions, and legal precedents. They couldn't just like wing it, when it came to inheritance rulings.
It's like they built safeguards into the system.
Yes.
To try and like eliminate any possibility of bias.
Exactly.
Or arbitrariness.
Decisions had to be rooted in solid evidence and clear legal principles. And this emphasis on certainty wasn't just like some theoretical thing, It also played out in like the very practical aspects of distributing inheritance.
Like we saw with that example of unclear death, right?
Precisely.
If there's no clear evidence of who died first, you hold off. You don't distribute the inheritance.
You err on the side of caution. The system, at its heart, it aims for fairness. And it seeks to prevent those messy disputes that can arise, when things are uncertain.
Right.
So it is a cautious approach.
Yeah.
But it's one that's designed to protect everyone.
It's like they approach law with this like scientific mindset.
I like that comparison.
Yeah.
You need data. You need proof before you draw conclusions.
Now, going back to the Muwatta Imam Malik, there's a section that deals with something called the child of Lurian.
Okay.
And the child of fornication. I'll admit I'm not entirely sure what those terms mean or how they fit into this whole inheritance system.
Of course.
Can you kind of shed some light on that for us?
So these are definitely some of the more complex and nuanced cases that are outlined in the text. Bly Quran refers to a specific legal procedure that's used when a husband accuses his wife of adultery.
Okay.
But he doesn't have the 4 witnesses required to prove it in court.
Oh, wow.
So what happens is both the husband and the wife swear oaths before God.
Wow.
Basically invoking like a divine curse on themselves if they're lying.
That's intense. It's like a spiritual test of truth.
Yeah, it was definitely a serious matter. And the child that's born out of this disputed situation is called the child of flattery.
Okay.
Then you have the child of fornication, which refers to a child that's born outside of a legally recognized marriage.
Okay, I'm starting to see how complex this can get.
Yeah.
How do you even determine inheritance rights in these cases?
Right.
Where the father's identity is either disputed or totally unknown.
Right.
Seems like it'd be tricky to figure out lineage and rightful heirs.
You're absolutely right. It can be very tangled. But the Muwatta Imam Malik does provide some guidance. Essentially, the mother inherits from both the child of liens and the child of fornication according to those fixed shares we talked about in the Quran.
So despite the ambiguity surrounding the father, the mother's rights as a parent are protected.
Exactly. The mother's biological connection to the child is undeniable.
Yeah.
So her right to inherit is upheld regardless of the circumstances of the child's birth.
Now, what about siblings? Do they have a claim in these cases?
Yes, maternal siblings are also entitled to inherit.
Okay.
Since their blood tie to the child is also clear.
Okay.
However, paternal siblings are excluded.
Right.
Because, again, the father's identity is either disputed or entirely unknown. Certainty, remember?
Right. That makes sense given the emphasis on certainty that we talked about.
Exactly. You can't inherit if there's doubt about your connection to the deceased.
Okay.
Now, here's where things get even more fascinating.
Okay.
After the mother and maternal siblings receive their shares, what happens to the remaining inheritance?
Yeah.
It depends on the mother's social status.
Wait, really? How does that work?
Well, if the mother was a freed slave, any remaining inheritance would actually go to her former masters.
Oh, wow.
This reflects the social structures of the time.
Yeah.
Even after being freed, many slaves maintained ties with their former masters.
Right.
And those ties sometimes extended to inheritance.
It's almost like an extension of that prior relationship.
Yeah.
Even though the formal bonds of slavery have been broken.
You could see it that way.
Okay.
But if the mother was a free woman from birth, the remaining inheritance would go to the Muslim community as a whole.
Oh, wow. That's a really remarkable concept.
It is.
It's like the inheritance kind of reverts back to this broader community.
Yes.
When there are no clear paternal heirs.
And this highlights another aspect of Islamic inheritance law that I find so fascinating, this attempt to create like a safety net. The system seeks to ensure that wealth is distributed fairly.
Yeah.
And that it doesn't just disappear into a void,
right.
even in these complex or unusual situations.
It's amazing how much foresight and consideration went into developing this whole system.
It's true.
It's incredibly intricate, but it's also remarkably logical
Yes.
and, in its own way, quite fair.
I couldn't agree more. It's a testament to the brilliance and the social consciousness of
Right.
these early Islamic legal scholars.
Mm-hmm.
They were really grappling with these complicated social issues and trying to find solutions that aligned with their understanding of divine principles and human needs.
Okay, before we wrap up, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on.
Okay.
The Muwatta Imam Malik also talks about those who are specifically excluded from inheritance.
Yes.
You mentioned paternal aunts and maternal uncles earlier.
Right.
Could you maybe expand on that a bit?
Of course. It's an important part of this whole conversation because it really helps us to understand who's in and who's out, so to speak, when it comes to these inheritance rights. And it underscores that emphasis on particular kinds of family relationships. As we've been seeing, agnatic lineage, that connection through the father's side is key.
Right.
So paternal aunts, while they are blood relatives, they don't inherit. And neither do maternal uncles because they're on the mother's side of the family.
So even though they're blood relatives, their connection isn't considered strong enough to warrant a share of the inheritance. Is there any specific reason given in the text as to why these relatives are excluded?
Well, the text doesn't go into great detail about the rationale behind each exclusion. I think we can look at the broader context of this whole inheritance system to understand the likely reasons. The emphasis on the paternal lineage is certainly a major factor. But there's also that practical consideration of keeping the circle of heirs manageable. If you included every distant relative, things would get really complicated really quickly.
Right.
And of course, there's the issue of potential conflicts between different branches of the family. By drawing these clear lines of inheritance, the system may have aimed to minimize those disputes and disagreements.
It's like they were trying to find this balance between recognizing blood ties and maintaining a certain, order and clarity in the process.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And the Muwatta Imam Malik really gives us a fascinating glimpse into how they were trying to strike that balance back in the 8th century.
It's really incredible how much we can learn about a society.
Yeah.
Just by examining its inheritance laws. It's like peeling back layers of history, revealing the values, the social structures, the beliefs that shaped their world.
Absolutely. These laws weren't just about dividing up wealth.
Right.
They were about shaping families, defining relationships,
Yeah.
and ensuring that society as a whole functions smoothly.
It's a window into the very soul of a civilization, isn't it?
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
It's an invitation for us to reflect, to compare, to learn from the past, and to think critically about how we approach similar issues in our own time.
It's amazing how much ground we've covered already.
It is.
We've gone from those basic principles of fixed shares all the way to these more complex scenarios involving disputed parentage, excluded relatives.
Yes.
And yet it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
The world of Islamic inheritance law is vast and intricate.
Yeah.
We could spend hours unpacking all of its nuances.
Before we get too carried away, though, I think it's time to move on to our final part of this deep dive. I think it's fascinating how much emphasis is placed on, knowledge and certainty in Islamic inheritance law.
You're so right.
They really wanted to avoid making decisions based on just, assumptions or guesswork.
That's a really keen observation, and it really gets at this this core principle that's kind of woven throughout Islamic jurisprudence.
Right.
The profound significance of ilm, or knowledge.
Right.
So judges and legal scholars, back then, they were expected to have this incredible depth of understanding of the Quran, the Sunnah, which are the Prophet's traditions, and legal precedents.
Okay.
Before they could even think about issuing rulings on inheritance.
So it wasn't just a matter of, skimming a few verses and being like, oh, yeah, this sounds about right.
Definitely not. Those decisions had to be grounded in solid evidence and clear legal principles. And this wasn't just some abstract ivory tower concept either.
Right.
This need for certainty, it played out in the very practical aspects of how inheritances were actually distributed.
Right, like we saw with that example of unclear deaths.
Precisely.
You can't determine who died first, so you don't just, randomly assign inheritance.
Right.
The system basically says, halt, we need more information.
You err on the side of caution.
Yeah.
The system at its heart It aims for fairness.
Okay.
It seeks to prevent those messy disputes that can arise when things are uncertain. So it is a cautious approach.
Right.
But it's one that's designed to protect everyone.
It strikes me that there's almost like a scientific approach to law in this system.
I like that comparison.
You need data, you need proof before you can reach any conclusions.
Absolutely. It really captures that emphasis on rigor and objectivity.
Okay, so we've explored this very intricate world of Islamic inheritance law.
Yes.
With its fixed shares, its emphasis on lineage, this careful consideration of different family relationships,
Right.
its commitment to fairness and certainty. What I'm wondering now is, where do our listeners go from here?
Yeah.
If they want to dive deeper.
Well, the Muwatta Imam Malik, that's a great starting point, of course.
Okay.
It lays out those foundational principles. It offers us, this glimpse into the legal thinking of that era.
Okay.
But it's important to remember it's just one piece.
Right.
Of a much larger and more intricate puzzle.
So it's like opening a door to this whole library of knowledge that's just waiting to be explored.
Exactly. There are countless books and articles, online resources that go into much more depth. They explore those different schools of thought within Islamic jurisprudence. They even look at contemporary interpretations and applications of these principles. Yeah. It's a really rich and fascinating field of study.
And it's not just about, memorizing rules.
No.
Right? It's about engaging with a legal system.
Yes.
That reflects these profound values.
Absolutely.
About family, about community.
Responsibility.
Yeah, about the responsible distribution of wealth.
Beautifully said. It's an invitation to think critically, to ask questions, to challenge assumptions, and to consider how these centuries-old principles might inform our own understanding of justice and fairness in the world today.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Islamic inheritance law. We've explored the fixed shares, the emphasis on lineage, those complexities of family relationships, that role of knowledge and certainty.
So much more.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. I want to thank you and, of course, our listeners for joining us on this intellectual adventure. And I hope that it sparked your curiosity and inspired you to, maybe keep exploring this fascinating world of Islamic jurisprudence.
Until next time, may your pursuit of knowledge be filled with light and insight.